Ghosts of My Life, Writings on Depression, Hauntology and Lost Futures by Mark Fisher. Chapter 0, Lost Futures, The Slow Cancellation of the Future. There's no time here, not anymore. The final image of the British television series Sapphire and Steel seemed designed to haunt the adolescent mind. The two lead characters, played by Joanna Lumley and David McCallum, find themselves in what seems to be a 1940s roadside cafe. The radio is playing a simulation of Glenn Miller-style smooth big band jazz. Another couple, a man and a woman dressed in 1940s clothes, are sitting at an adjacent table. The woman rises, saying, "This is a trap. This is nowhere, and it's forever." She and her companion then disappear, leaving spectral outlines, then nothingness. Sapphire and Steel panic. They rifle through the few objects in the cafe, looking for something they can use to escape. There is nothing, and when they pull back the curtains, there is only a black starry void beyond the window. The cafe, it seems, is some kind of capsule floating in deep space. Watching this extraordinary final sequence now, the juxtaposition of the cafe with the cosmos is likely to put in mind some combination of Edward Hopper and René Magritte. Neither of these references were available to me at the time. In fact, when I later encountered Hopper and Magritte, I no doubt thought of Sapphire and Steel. It was August 1982 and I had just turned 15 years old. It would be more than 20 years later before I would see these images again. But then, thanks to VHS, DVD and YouTube, it seemed that practically everything was available for re-watching. In conditions of digital recall, loss is itself lost. The passage of 30 years has only made the series appear even stranger than it did at the time. This was science fiction with none of the traditional trappings of the genre. No spaceships, no ray guns, no anthropomorphic foes. Only the unravelling fabric of the corridor of time, along which malevolent entities would crawl, exploiting and expanding gaps and fissures in temporal continuity. All we knew about Sapphire and Steel was that they were detectives of a peculiar kind, probably not human, sent from a mysterious agency to repair these breaks in time. The basis of Sapphire and Steel, the series creator P.J. Hammond explained, came from my desire to write a detective story, into which I wanted to incorporate time. I've always been interested in time, particularly the ideas of J.B. Priestley and H.G. Wells. But I wanted to take a different approach to the subject. So instead of having them go backwards and forwards in time, it was about time breaking in, and having set the precedent, I realised the potential that it offered with two people whose job it was to stop the break-ins. Hammond had previously worked as a writer on police dramas such as The Gentle Touch and Hunter's Walk, and on children's fantasy shows like Ace of Wands and Dramarama. With Sapphire and Steel, he attained a kind of auteurship that he would never manage to repeat. The conditions for this kind of visionary public broadcasting would disappear during the 1980s, as the British media became taken over by what another television auteur, Dennis Potter, would call the occupying powers of neoliberalism. The result of that occupation is that it is now hard to believe that such a programme could ever have been transmitted on primetime television, still less on what was then Britain's sole commercial network, ITV. There were only 3 television channels in Britain then: BBC One, BBC Two and ITV. Channel 4 would make its first broadcast only a few months later. By comparison with the expectations created by Star Wars, Sapphire and Steel came off as very cheap and cheerful. Even in 1982, the chroma key special effects looked unconvincing. The fact that the stage sets were minimal and the cast small, most of the assignments only featured Lumley and McCallum and a handful of others, gave the impression of a theatre production. Yet there was none of the homeliness of kitchen sink naturalism. Sapphire and Steel had more in common with the enigmatic oppressiveness of Harold Pinter, whose plays were frequently broadcast on BBC television during the 1970s. A number of things about the series are particularly striking from the perspective of the 21st century. The first is its absolute refusal to meet the audience halfway in the way we've come to expect. This is partly a conceptual matter. Sapphire and Steel was cryptic, its stories and its world never fully disclosed, still less explained. The series was much closer to something like the BBC's adaptation of John le Carré Smiley's novels. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy had been broadcast in 1979. Its sequel, Smiley's People, would begin transmission a month after Sapphire and Steel ended, than it was to Star Wars. It was also a question of emotional tenor. The series and its two lead characters are lacking in the warmth and wisecracking humour that is now so much a taken-for-granted feature of entertainment media. McCallum's Steel has a technician's indifference towards the lives in which he became reluctantly enmeshed. Although he never loses his sense of duty, he is testy and impatient, frequently exacerbated by the way humans clutter their lives. If Lumley's Sapphire appeared more sympathetic, there was always the suspicion that her apparent affection towards humans was something like an owner's benign fascination for her pets. The emotional austerity that had characterized the series from the start assumes a more explicitly pessimistic quality in this final assignment. The La Cara parallels are reinforced by the strong suspicion that, just as in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the lead characters have been betrayed by their own side. Then there was Cyril Ornandel's incidental music. As Nick Edwards explained in a 2009 blog post, this was arranged for a small ensemble of musicians, predominantly woodwind, with liberal use of electronic treatments, ring modulation, echo and delay, to intensify the drama and suggestion of horror. Ornandel's cues are far more powerfully chilling and evocative than anything you'd likely hear in the mainstream media today. One aim of Sapphire and Steel was to transpose ghost stories out of the Victorian context and into contemporary places, the still inhabited or the recently abandoned. In the final assignment, Sapphire and Steel arrive at a small service station. Corporate logos, Access, 7-Up, Castrol, GTX, LV are pasted on the windows and the walls of the garage and the adjoining cafe. This halfway place is a prototype version of what the anthropologist Marc Auger will call in a 1995 book of the same title, non-places. The generic zones of transit, retail parks and airports, which will come to increasingly dominate the spaces of late capitalism. In truth, the modest service station in Sapphire and Steel is quaintly idiosyncratic compared to the clone generic monoliths which will proliferate beside motorways over the coming 30 years. The problem that Sapphire and Steel have come to solve is, as ever, to do with time. At the service station, there is temporal bleed-through from earlier periods. Images and figures from 1925 and 1948 keep appearing, so that, as Sapphire and Steel's colleague Silver puts it, time just got mixed, jumbled up together, making no sort of sense. Anachronism, the slippage of discrete time periods into one another, was throughout the series the major symptom of time breaking down. In one of the earlier assignments, Steele complains that these temporal anomalies are triggered by human beings' predilection for the mixing of artifacts from different eras. In this final assignment, the anachronism has led to stasis. Time has stopped. The service station is in a pocket, a vacuum. There's still traffic, but it's not going anywhere. The sound of cars is locked into a looped drone. Silver says, "There is no time here, not anymore." It's as if the whole scenario is a literalization of the lines in Pinter's No Man's Land. No man's land, which never moves, which never changes, which never grows older, which remains forever icy and silent. Hammond said that he had not necessarily intended the series to end there. He had thought that it would be rested to return at some point in the future. There would be no return, at least not on network television. In 2004, Sapphire and Steel would come back for a series of audio adventures, though Hammond, McCallum and Lumley were not involved, and by then the audience was not the television viewing public, but the kind of special interest niche easily catered for in a digital culture. Eternally suspended, never to be freed, their plight, and indeed their provenance, never to be fully explained. Sapphire and Steel's internment in this cafe from nowhere is prophetic for a general condition in which life continues but time has somehow stopped. The slow cancellation of the future. It is the contention of this book that 21st century culture is marked by the same anachronism and inertia which afflicted Sapphire and Steel in their final adventure. But this stasis has been buried, interred behind a superficial frenzy of newness, of perpetual movement. The jumbling up of time, the montaging of earlier eras, has ceased to be worthy of comment. It is now so prevalent that it is no longer even noticed. In his book After the Future, Franco Biffo Berardi refers to the slow cancellation of the future that got underway in the 70s and 80s. But when I say future, he elaborates. I am not referring to the direction of time. I am thinking rather of the psychological perception which emerged in the cultural situation of progressive modernity, the cultural expectations that were fabricated during the long period of modern civilization, reaching a peak after the Second World War. These expectations were shaped in the conceptual frameworks of an ever-progressing development, albeit through different methodologies. The Hegel-Marxist mythology of Aufhebung and founding of the new totality of communism, the bourgeois mythology of a linear development of welfare and democracy, the technocratic mythology of the all-encompassing power of scientific knowledge, and so on. My generation grew up at the peak of this mythological temporalization, and it is very difficult, maybe impossible, to get rid of it and look at reality without this kind of temporal lens. I'll never be able to live in accordance with the new reality, no matter how evident, unmistakable, or even dazzling its social planetary trends. Biffo is a generation older than me, but he and I are on the same side of a temporal split here. I too will never be able to adjust to the paradoxes of this new situation. The immediate temptation here is to fit what I'm saying into a wearily familiar narrative. It is a matter of the old failing to come to terms with the new, saying it was better in their day. Yet it is just this picture, with its assumption that the young are automatically at the leading edge of cultural change, that is now out of date. Rather than the old recoiling from the new in fear and incomprehension, those whose expectations were formed in an earlier era are more likely to be startled by the sheer persistence of recognizable forms. Nowhere is this clearer than in popular music culture. It was through the mutations of popular music that many of those of us who grew up in the 60s, 70s and 80s learned to measure the passage of cultural time. But faced with 21st century music, it is the very sense of future shock which has disappeared. This is quickly established by performing a simple thought experiment. Imagine any record released in the past couple of years being beamed back in time to, say, 1995 and played on the radio. It is hard to think that it would produce any jolt in the listeners. On the contrary, what would be likely to shock our 1995 audience would be the very recognizability of the sounds. Would music really have changed so little in the next 17 years? Contrast this with the rapid turnover of styles between the 60s and the 90s. Play a jungle record from 1993 to someone in 1989, and it would have sounded like something so new that it would have challenged them to rethink what music was, or could be. While 20th century experimental culture was seized by a recombinatorial delirium, which made it feel as if newness was infinitely available, the 21st century is oppressed by a crushing sense of finitude and exhaustion. It doesn't feel like the future, or alternatively, it doesn't feel as if the 21st century has started yet. We remain trapped in the 20th century, just as Sapphire and Steel were incarcerated in their roadside cafe. The slow cancellation of the future has been accompanied by a deflation of expectations. There can be few who believe that in the coming year, a record as great as, say, The Stooges' Funhouse or Sly Stone's There's a Riot Going On will be released. Still less do we expect the kind of ruptures brought about by the Beatles or disco. The feeling of belatedness, of living after the gold rush, is as omnipresent as it is disavowed. Compare the fallow terrain of the current moment with the fecundity of previous periods, and you will quickly be accused of nostalgia. But the reliance of current artists on styles that were established long ago suggests that the current moment is in the grip of a formal nostalgia, of which more shortly. It is not that nothing happened in the period when the slow cancellation of the future set in. On the contrary, those 30 years have been a time of massive traumatic change. In the UK, the election of Margaret Thatcher had brought to an end the uneasy compromises of the so-called post-war social consensus. Thatcher's neoliberal programme in politics was reinforced by a transnational restructuring of the capitalist economy. The shift into so-called post-Fordism with globalization, ubiquitous computerization, and the casualization of labour, resulted in a complete transformation in the way that work and leisure were organised. In the last 10 to 15 years, meanwhile, the internet and mobile telecommunications technology have altered the texture of everyday experience beyond all recognition. Yet, perhaps because of all this, there's an increasing sense that culture has lost the ability to grasp and articulate the present. Or it could be that, in one very important sense, there is no present to grasp and articulate anymore. Consider the fate of the concept of futuristic music. The futuristic in music has long since ceased to refer to any future that we expect to be different. It has become an established style, much like a particular typographical font. Invited to think of the futuristic, we will still come up with something like the music of Kraftwerk, even though this is now as antique as Glenn Miller's big band jazz was when the German group began experimenting with synthesizers in the early 70s. Where is the 21st century equivalent of Kraftwerk? If Kraftwerk's music came out of a casual intolerance of the already established, then the present moment is marked by its extraordinary accommodation towards the past. More than that, the very distinction between past and present is breaking down. In 81, the 60s seemed much farther away than they do today. Since then, cultural time has folded back on itself, and the impression of linear development has given way to a strange simultaneity. Two examples will suffice to introduce this peculiar temporality. When I first saw the video for the Arctic Monkeys' 2005 single, I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor, I genuinely believed that it was some lost artifact from circa 1980. Everything in the video, the lighting, the haircuts, the clothes, had been assembled to give the impression that this was a performance on BBC Two's serious rock show, The Old Grey Whistle Test. Furthermore, there was no discordance between the look and the sound. At least to a casual listen, this could quite easily have been a post-punk group from the early 80s. Certainly, if one performs a version of the thought experiment I described above, it's easy to imagine I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor being broadcast on the Old Grey Whistle Test in 1980 and producing no sense of disorientation in the audience. Like me, they might have imagined that the references to 1984 in the lyrics referred to the future. There ought to be something astonishing about this. Count back 25 years from 1980 and you are at the beginning of rock and roll. A record that sounded like Buddy Holly or Elvis in 1980 would have sounded out of time. Of course, such records were released in 1980, but they were marketed as retro. If the Arctic Monkeys weren't positioned as a retro group, it is partly because by 2005 there was no now by which to contrast their retrospection. In the 1990s, it was possible to hold something like Britpop revivalism to account by comparing it to the experimentalism happening on the UK dance underground or in US R&B. By 2005, the rates of innovation in both these areas had enormously slackened. UK dance music remains much more vibrant than rock, but the changes that happen there are tiny, incremental and detachable largely only by initiates. There is none of the dislocation of sensation that you heard in the shift from rave to jungle and from jungle to garage in the 1990s. As I write this, one of the dominant sounds in pop, the globalized club music that has supplanted R&B, resembles nothing more than Eurotrance, a particularly bland European 1990s cocktail made from some of the most flavourless components of house and techno. Second example. I first heard Amy Winehouse's version of Valerie while walking through a shopping mall, perhaps the perfect venue for consuming it. Up until then, I had believed that Valerie was first recorded by indie plodders the Zootons. But for a moment, the record's antiquated 60s soul sound and the vocal, which on a casual listen I didn't first recognise as Winehouse, made me temporarily revise this belief. Surely the Zootons version of the track was a cover of this apparently older track, which I had not heard until now. Naturally, it didn't take me long to realise that the 60s soul sound was actually a simulation. This was indeed a cover of the Zootons track, done in the souped-up retro style in which record producer Mark Ronson has specialised. Ronson's productions might have been designed to illustrate what Frederick Jameson called the nostalgia mode. Jameson identifies this tendency in his remarkably prescient writings on postmodernism, beginning in the 80s. What makes Valerie and the Arctic Monkeys typical of postmodern retro is the way in which they perform anachronism. While they are sufficiently historical sounding to pass on first listen as belonging to the period which they ape, there is something not quite right about them. Discrepancies in texture, the results of modern studio and recording techniques, mean that they belong neither to the present nor to the past, but to some implied timeless era, an eternal 60s or an eternal 80s. The classic sound, its elements now serenely liberated from the pressures of historical becoming, can now be periodically buffed up by new technology. It is important to be clear about what Jameson means by the nostalgia mode. He is not referring to psychological nostalgia. Indeed, the nostalgia mode as Jameson theorizes it might be said to preclude psychological nostalgia, since it arises only when a coherent sense of historical time breaks down. The kind of figure capable of exhibiting and expressing a yearning for the past belongs actually to a paradigmatically modernist approach. Think, for instance, of Proust's and Joyce's ingenious exercises in recovering lost time. Jameson's nostalgia mode is better understood in terms of a formal attachment to the techniques and formulas of the past, a consequence of a retreat from the modernist challenge of innovating cultural forms adequate to contemporary experience. Jameson's example is Lawrence Kasdan's now half-forgotten film Body Heat, which, although it was officially set in the 80s, feels as if it belongs to the 30s. Body Heat is technically not a nostalgia film, Jameson writes, since it takes place in a contemporary setting in a little Florida village near Miami. On the other hand, this technical contemporaneity is most ambiguous indeed. Technically, its objects, its cars for instance, are 80s products, but everything in the film conspires to blur that immediate contemporary reference and to make it possible to receive this too as nostalgia work, as a narrative set in some indefinable nostalgic past. An eternal 30s, say, beyond history. It seems to me exceedingly symptomatic to find the very style of nostalgia films invading and colonizing even those movies today which have contemporary settings, as though for some reason we were unable today to focus our own present, as though we had become incapable of achieving aesthetic representations of our own current experience. But if that is so, then it is a terrible indictment of consumer capitalism itself, or at the very least an alarming and pathological symptom of a society that has become incapable of dealing with time and history. What blocks Body Heat from being a period piece or a nostalgia picture in any straightforward way is its disavowal of any explicit reference to the past. The result is anachronism, and the paradox is that this blurring of official contemporaneity, this waning of historicity, is increasingly typical of our experience of cultural products. Another of Jameson's examples of nostalgia mode is Star Wars. One of the most important cultural experiences of the generations that grew up from the 30s to the 50s was the Saturday afternoon series of the Buck Rogers type. Alien villains, true American heroes, heroines in distress, the death ray or the doomsday box, and the cliffhanger at the end whose miraculous solution was to be witnessed next Saturday afternoon. Star Wars reinvents this experience in the form of a pastiche. There is no point to a parody of such series since they are long extinct. Far from being a pointless satire of such dead forms, Star Wars satisfies a deep, might I even say repressed, longing to experience them again. It is a complex object in which on some first level, children and adolescents can take the adventures straight, while the adult public is able to gratify a deeper and more properly nostalgic desire to return to that old period and to live its strange old aesthetic artifacts through once again. There is no nostalgia for a historical period here, or if there is, it is only indirect. The longing of which Jameson writes is a yearning for a form. Star Wars is a particularly resonant example of postmodern anachronism because of the way it used technology to obfuscate its archaic form. Belying its origins in these fusty adventure series forms, Star Wars could appear new because its then unprecedented special effects relied upon the latest technology. If, in a paradigmatically modernist way, Kraftwerk used technology to allow new forms to emerge, the nostalgia mode subordinated technology to the task of refurbishing the old. The effect was to disguise the disappearance of the future as its opposite. The future didn't disappear overnight. Berardi's phrase, the slow cancellation of the future, is so apt because it captures the gradual yet relentless way in which the future has been eroded over the last 30 years. If the late 70s and early 80s were the moment when the current crisis of cultural temporality could first be felt, it was only during the first decade of the 21st century that what Simon Reynolds calls dyschronia has become endemic. This dyschronia, this temporal disjuncture, ought to feel uncanny, yet the predominance of what Reynolds calls retromania means that it has lost any unheimlich charge. Anachronism is now taken for granted. Jameson's postmodernism, with its tendencies toward retrospection and pastiche, has been naturalized. Take someone like the stupendously successful Adele. Although her music is not marked as retro, there is nothing that marks out her records as belonging to the 21st century either. Like so much contemporary cultural production, Adele's recordings are saturated with a vague but persistent feeling of the past without recalling any specific historical moment. Jameson equates the postmodern waning of historicity with the cultural logic of late capitalism, but he says little about why the two are synonymous. Why did the arrival of neoliberal post-Fordist capitalism lead to a culture of retrospection and pastiche? Perhaps we can venture a couple of professional conjectures here. The first concerns consumption. Could it be that neoliberal capitalism's destruction of solidarity and security brought about a compensatory hungering for the well-established and the familiar? Paul Virilio has written of a polar inertia that is a kind of effect of and counterweight to the massive speeding up of communication. Virilio's example is Howard Hughes, living in one hotel room for 15 years, endlessly rewatching Ice Station Zebra. Hughes, once a pioneer in aeronautics, became an early explorer of the existential terrain that cyberspace will open up, where it is no longer necessary to physically move in order to access the whole history of culture. Or, as Berardi has argued, the intensity and precariousness of late capitalist work culture leaves people in a state where they are simultaneously exhausted and overstimulated. The combination of precarious work and digital communications leads to a besieging of attention. In this insomniac, inundated state, Berardi claims, culture becomes de-eroticized. The art of seduction takes too much time, and, according to Berardi, something like Viagra answers not to a biological but to a cultural deficit. Desperately short of time, energy and attention, we demand quick fixes. Like another of Berardi's examples, pornography, retro offers the quick and easy promise of a minimal variation on an already familiar satisfaction. The other explanation for the link between late capitalism and retrospection centres on production. Despite all its rhetoric of novelty and innovation, neoliberal capitalism has gradually but systematically deprived artists of the resources necessary to produce the new. In the UK, the post-war welfare state and higher education maintenance grants consisted an indirect source of funding for most of the experiments in popular culture between the 60s and the 80s. The subsequent ideological and practical attack on public services meant that one of the spaces where artists could be sheltered from the pressure to produce something that was immediately successful was severely circumscribed. As public service broadcasting became marketized, there was an increased tendency to turn out cultural productions that resembled what was already successful. The result of all of this is that the social time available for withdrawing from work and immersing oneself in cultural production drastically declined. If there's one factor above all else which contributes to cultural conservatism, it is the vast inflation in the cost of rent and mortgages. It's no accident that the efflorescence of cultural invention in London and New York in the late 70s and early 80s, in the punk and post-punk scenes, coincided with the availability of squatted and cheap property in those cities. Since then, the decline of social housing, the attacks on squatting, and the delirious rise in property prices have meant that the amount of time and energy available for cultural production has massively diminished. But perhaps it was only with the arrival of digital communicative capitalism that this reached terminal crisis point. Naturally, the besieging of attention described by Berardi applies to producers as much as consumers. Producing the new depends upon certain kinds of withdrawal, from, for instance, sociality as much as from pre-existing cultural forms. But the currently dominant form of socially networked cyberspace, with its endless opportunities for micro-contact and its deluge of YouTube links, has made withdrawal more difficult than ever before. Or, as Simon Reynolds so pithily put it, in recent years, everyday life has sped up, but culture has slowed down. No matter what the causes for this temporal pathology are, it is clear that no area of Western culture is immune from them. The former redoubts of futurism, such as electronic music, no longer offer escape from formal nostalgia. Music culture is, in many ways, paradigmatic of the fate of culture under post-Fordist capitalism. At the level of form, music is locked into pastiche and repetition, but its infrastructure has been subject to massive, unpredictable change. The old paradigms of consumption, retail, and distribution are disintegrating, with downloading eclipsing the physical object, record shops closing, and cover art disappearing. Why hauntology? What has the concept of hauntology to do with all this? It was in fact with some reluctance that hauntology started to be applied to the electronic music of the middle of the last decade. I'd generally found Jacques Derrida, the inventor of the term, a frustrating thinker. As soon as it was established in certain areas of the academy, deconstruction, the philosophical project which Derrida founded, installed itself as a pious cult of indeterminacy, which at worst made a lawyerly virtue of avoiding any definitive claim. Deconstruction was a kind of pathology of skepticism, which induced hedging, infirmity of purpose, and compulsory doubt in its followers. It elevated particular modes of academic practice, Heidegger's priestly opacity, literary theory's emphasis on the ultimate instability of any interpretation, into quasi-theological imperatives. Derrida's circumlocutions seemed like a de-intensifying influence. It's by no means irrelevant to point out here that my first encounter with Derrida took place in what is now a vanished milieu. It came in the pages of the New Musical Express in the 1980s, where Derrida's name would be mentioned by the most exciting writers. And actually, part of my frustration with Derrida's work came out of disappointment. The enthusiasm of enemies writers like Ian Penman and Mark Sinker for Derrida, and the formal and conceptual inventiveness it seemed to provoke in their writing, created expectations which Derrida's own work couldn't meet when I eventually came to read it. It's hard to believe this now, but along with public service broadcasting, the NME constituted a kind of supplementary informal education system, in which theory acquired a strange, lustrous glamour. I had also seen Derrida in Ken McMullen's film Ghost Dance, shown late at night on Channel 4 in the early days of the network, at a time before we had VCR, when I had to resort to washing my face with cold water to try to keep myself awake. Derrida coined the term hauntology in his Spectres of Marx, The State of the Dead, The Work of Mourning, and The New International. To haunt does not mean to be present, and it is necessary to introduce haunting into the very construction of a concept, he wrote. Hauntology was this concept, or puncept. The pun was on the philosophical concept of ontology, the philosophical study of what can be said to exist. Hauntology was the successor to previous concept of Derrida's, such as the trace and différance. Like those earlier terms, it referred to the way in which nothing enjoys a purely positive existence. Everything that exists is possible only on the basis of a whole series of absences, which precede and surround it, allowing it to possess such consistency and intelligibility that it does. In the famous example, any particular linguistic term gains its meaning not from its own positive qualities, but from its difference from other terms. Hence Derrida's ingenious deconstructions of the metaphysics of presence and phonocentrism, which exposed the way in which particular dominant forms of thought had, incoherently, privileged the voice over writing. But hauntology explicitly brings into play the question of time in a way that had not quite been the case with the trace or différance. One of the repeated phrases in Spectres of Marx is from Hamlet. The time is out of joint, and in his recent Radical Atheism, Derrida and the Time of Life, Martin Haglund argues that it is possible to see all of Derrida's work in relation to this concept of broken time. Derrida's aim, Haglund argues, is to formulate a general hauntology in contrast to the traditional ontology that thinks being in terms of self-identical presence. What is important about the figure of spectre, then, is that it cannot be fully present. It has no being in itself, but marks a relation to what is no longer or not yet. Is hauntology, then, some attempt to revive the supernatural, or is it just a figure of speech? The way out of this unhelpful opposition is to think of hauntology as the agency of the virtual, with the spectre understood not as anything supernatural, but as that which acts without physically existing. The great thinkers of modernity, Freud as well as Marx, had discovered different modes of this spectral causality. The late capitalist world, governed by the abstractions of finance, is very clearly a world in which virtualities are effective, and perhaps the most ominous spectre of Marx is capital itself. But as Derrida underlines in his interviews in the Ghost dance film, psychoanalysis is also a science of ghosts, a study of how reverberant events in the psyche become revenants. Referring back to Hagelund's distinction between the no longer and the not yet, we can provisionally distinguish two directions in hauntology. The first refers to that which is, in actuality is, no longer, but which remains effective as a virtuality, the traumatic compulsion to repeat a fatal pattern. The second sense of hauntology refers to that which, in actuality, has not yet happened, but which is already effective in the virtual, an attractor, an anticipation shaping current behaviour. The spectre of communism that Marx and Engels had warned of in the first lines of the Communist Manifesto was just this kind of ghost, a virtuality whose threatened coming was already playing a part in undermining the present state of things. In addition to being another moment in Derrida's own philosophical project of deconstruction, Spectres of Marx was also a specific engagement with the immediate historical context provided by the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. Or rather, it was an engagement with the alleged disappearance of history trumpeted by Francis Fukuyama in his The End of History and the Last Man. What would happen now that actually existing socialism had collapsed and capitalism could assume full spectral dominance? Its claims to global dominion were thwarted not any longer by the existence of a whole other bloc, but by small islands of resistance such as Cuba and North Korea. The era of what I have called capitalist realism, the widespread belief that there is no alternative to capitalism, has been haunted not by the apparition of the spectre of communism, but by its disappearance. As Derrida wrote, "There is today in the world a dominant discourse. This dominating discourse often has the manic, jubilatory and incantatory form that Freud assigned to the so-called triumphant phase of morning work. The incantation repeats and ritualizes itself. It holds forth and holds to formulas, like any animalistic magic. To the rhythm of a cadenced march, it proclaims, 'Marx is dead, communism is dead, very dead, and along with it, its hopes, its discourse, its theories and its practices.' It says, 'Long live capitalism, long live the market, here's to the survival of economic and political liberalism.'" Spectres of Marx was also a series of speculations about the media, or post-media technologies that capital had installed on its now global territory. In this sense, hauntology was by no means something rarefied. It was endemic in the time of techno-telediscursivity, techno-tele-iconicity, simulacra, and synthetic images. This discussion of the tele shows that hauntology concerns a crisis of space as well as time. As theorists such as Virilio and Jean Baudrillard had long acknowledged, and Spectres of Marx can also be read as Derrida settling his account with these thinkers, teletechnologies collapse both space and time. Events that are spatially distant become available to an audience instantaneously. Neither Baudrillard nor Derrida would live to see the full effects. No doubt I should say the full effects so far of the teletechnology that has most radically contracted space and time, cyberspace. But here we have a first reason why the concept of hauntology should have become attached to popular culture in the first decade of the 21st century. For it was at this moment when cyberspace enjoyed unprecedented dominion over the reception, distribution, and consumption of culture, especially music culture. When it was first applied to music culture, in my own writing and in that of other critics such as Simon Reynolds and Joseph Stannard, hauntology first of all named a confluence of artists. The word confluence is crucial here. For these artists, William Basinski, the Ghostbox label, The Caretaker, Burial, Mordant Music, Philip Jack, amongst others, had converged on a certain terrain without actually influencing one another. What they shared was not a sound so much as a sensibility, an existential orientation. The artists that came to be labelled hauntological were suffused with an overwhelming melancholy, and they were preoccupied with the way in which technology materialized memory. Hence a fascination with television, vinyl records, audio tape, and with the sounds of these technologies breaking down. The fixation on materialized memory led to what is perhaps the principal sonic signature of hauntology, the use of crackle, the surface noise made by vinyl. Crackle makes us aware that we are listening to a time that is out of joint. It won't allow us to fall into the illusion of presence. It reverses the normal order of listening, according to which, as Ian Penman puts it, we are habituated into the of recording being repressed. We aren't only made aware that the sounds we are hearing are recorded, we are also made conscious of the playback systems we use to access the recordings. And hovering behind much sonic hauntology is the difference between analog and digital. So many hauntological tracks have been about revisiting the physicality of analog media in the era of digital ether. MP3 files remain material, of course, but their materiality is occulted from us, by contrast with the tactile materiality of vinyl records and even compact discs. No doubt a yearning for this older regime of materiality plays a part in the melancholia that saturates hauntological music. As to the deeper causes of this melancholia, we need look no further than the title of Leyland Kirby's album, Sadly, the Future is No Longer What It Was. In hauntological music, there's an implicit acknowledgement that the hopes created by post-war electronica or by the euphoric dance music of the 90s have evaporated. Not only has the future not arrived, it no longer seems possible. Yet at the same time, the music constitutes a refusal to give up on the desire for the future. This refusal gives the melancholia a political dimension, because it amounts to a failure to accommodate the closed horizons of capitalist realism. Not giving up the ghost. In Freud's terms, both mourning and melancholia are about loss. But whereas mourning is the slow, painful withdrawal of libido from the lost object, in melancholia, libido remains attached to what has disappeared. For mourning to properly begin, Derrida says in Spectres of Marx, the dead must be conjured away. The conjuration has to make sure that the dead will not come back. Quick, do whatever is needed to keep the cadaver localized, in a safe place, decomposing right where it was inhumed, or even embalmed as they like to do in Moscow. But there are those who refuse to allow the body to be interred, just as there is a danger of overkilling something to such an extent that it becomes a spectre, a pure virtuality. Capitalist societies, Derrida writes, can always heave a sigh of relief and say to themselves, communism is finished. But it did not take place, it was only a ghost. They do no more than disavow the undeniable itself. A ghost never dies, it remains always to come and to come back. Haunting, then, can be construed as a failed mourning. It is about refusing to give up the ghost, or, and this can sometimes amount to the same thing, the refusal of the ghost to give up on us. The spectre will not allow us to settle into, for the mediocre satisfactions one can glean in a world governed by capitalist realism. What's at stake in 21st century hauntology is not the disappearance of a particular object. What has vanished is a tendency, a virtual trajectory. One name for this tendency is popular modernism. The cultural ecology that I referred to above, the music press and the more challenging parts of public service broadcasting were part of a UK popular modernism, as were post-punk, brutalist architecture, penguin paperbacks and the BBC radiophonic workshop. In popular modernism, the elitist project of modernism was retrospectively vindicated. At the same time, popular culture definitively established that it did not have to be populist. Particular modernist techniques were not only disseminated, but collectively reworked and extended, just as the modernist task of producing forms which were adequate to the present moment were taken up and renewed. Which is to say that, although of course I didn't realise it at the time, the culture which shaped most of my early expectations was essentially popular modernist, and the writings that have been collected in Ghosts of My Life is about coming to terms with the disappearance of the conditions which allowed it to exist. It's worth pausing a moment here to distinguish the hauntological melancholia I'm talking about from two other kinds of melancholia. The first is what Wendy Brown calls left melancholy. On the face of it, what I've said risks being heard as a kind of leftist melancholic resignation. Although they weren't perfect, the institutions of social democracy were much better than anything we can hope for now, perhaps the best we can ever hope for. In her essay, Resisting Left Melancholy, Brown attacks a left that operates without either a deep and radical critique of the status quo or a compelling alternative to the existing order of things. But perhaps even more troubling is a left that has become more attached to its impossibility than to its potential fruitfulness. A left that is most at home dwelling not in hopefulness but in its own marginality and failure. A left that is thus caught in a structure of melancholic attachment to a certain strain of its own dead past, whose spirit is ghostly, whose structure of desire is backward-looking and punishing. Yet much of what makes the melancholy Brown analyses so pernicious is its disavowed quality. Brown's left melancholic is a depressive who believes he is realistic, someone who no longer has any expectation that his desire for radical transformation could be achieved, but who doesn't recognize that he has given up. In her discussion of Brown's essay in The Communist Horizon, Jodi Dean refers to Lacan's formula. The only thing one can be guilty of is giving ground relative to one's desire, and the shift that Brown describes, from a left that confidently assumed the future belonged to it, to a left that makes a virtue of its own incapacity to act, seems to exemplify the transition from desire, which in Lacanian terms is the desire, to drive, an enjoyment through failure. The kind of melancholia I'm talking about, by contrast, consists not in giving up on desire, but in refusing to yield. It consists, that is to say, in a refusal to adjust to what current conditions call reality, even if the cost of that refusal is that you feel like an outcast in your own time. The second kind of melancholia that hauntological melancholia must be distinguished from is what Paul Gilroy calls post-colonial melancholia. Gilroy defines this melancholia in terms of an avoidance. It is about evading the painful obligations to work through the grim details of imperial and colonial history, and to transform paralyzing guilt into more productive shame that would be conducive to the building of a multicultural nationality that is no longer phobic about the prospect of exposure to either strangers or otherness. It comes out of a loss of a fantasy of omnipotence. Like Brown's left melancholia, then, post-colonial melancholia is a disavowed form of melancholia. Its signature combination, Gilroy writes, is that of a manic elation with misery, self-loathing and ambivalence. The post-colonial melancholic doesn't just refuse to accept change. At some level, he refuses to accept that change has happened at all. He incoherently holds on to the fantasy of omnipotence by experiencing change only as decline and failure, for which, naturally, the immigrant other must be blamed. The incoherence here is obvious. If the post-colonial melancholic were really omnipotent, how could he be harmed by the immigrant? At first sight, it might be possible to see hauntological melancholia as a variant of post-colonial melancholia, another example of white boy whinging over lost privileges. Yet this would be to grasp what has been lost only in terms of the worst kind of resentment, or in terms of what Alex Williams has called negative solidarity, in which we are invited to celebrate not an increase in liberation, but the fact that another group has now been immiserated. And this is especially sad when the group in question was predominantly working class. Nostalgia compared to what? This raises the question of nostalgia again. Is hauntology, as many of its critics have maintained, simply a name for nostalgia? Is it about pining for social democracy and its institutions? Given the ubiquity of the formal nostalgia I described above, the question has to be, nostalgia compared to what? It seems strange to have to argue that comparing the present unfavourably with the past is not automatically nostalgic in any culpable way, but such is the power of the dehistoricizing pressures of populism and PR that the claim has to be explicitly made. PR and populism propagate the relativistic illusion that intensity and innovation are equally distributed throughout all cultural periods. It is the tendency to falsely overestimate the past that makes nostalgia egregious. But one of the lessons of Andy Beckett's history of Britain in the 1970s, when the lights went out, is that, in many ways, we falsely underestimate a period like the 70s. Beckett, in effect, shows that capitalist realism was built on a myth-monstering of the decade. Conversely, we are induced by the ubiquitous PR into falsely overestimating the present, and those who can't remember the past are condemned to have it resold to them forever. If the 1970s were in many respects better than neoliberalism wants us to remember them, we must also recognise the extent to which the capitalist dystopia of 21st century culture is not something that was simply imposed on us. It was built out of our captured desires. Almost everything I was afraid of happening over the past 30 years has happened, Jeremy Gilbert has observed. Everything my political mentors warned might happen since I was a boy growing up on a poor council estate, that's a housing project if you're American, in the north of England in the early 80s, or a high school student reading denunciations of Thatcherism in the left press a few years later, has turned out just as badly as they said it would. And yet I don't wish I was living 40 years ago. The point seems to be this. This is the world we were all afraid of, but it's also sort of the world we wanted. But we shouldn't have to choose between, say, the internet and social security. One way of thinking about hauntology is that its lost futures do not force such false choices. Instead, what haunts is the spectre of a world in which all the marvels of communicative technology could be combined with a sense of solidarity much stronger than anything social democracy could muster. Popular modernism was by no means a completed project, some pristine zenith that needed no further improvement. In the 70s, certainly, culture was opened up to working class inventiveness in a way that is now scarcely imaginable to us. But this was also a time where casual racism, sexism, and homophobia were routine features of the mainstream. Needless to say, the struggles against racism and heterosexism have not in the meantime been won, but they have made significant hegemonic advances, even as neoliberalism has corroded the social democratic infrastructure which allowed increased working class participation in cultural production. The disarticulation of class from race, gender and sexuality has in fact been central to the success of the neoliberal project, making it seem grotesquely as if neoliberalism were in some way a precondition of the gains made in anti-racist, anti-sexist and anti-heterosexist struggles. What is being longed for in hauntology is not a particular period, but the resumption of the process of democratization and pluralism for which Gilroy calls. Perhaps it's useful to remind ourselves here that social democracy has only become a resolved totality in retrospect. At the time, it was a compromise formation, which those on the left saw as a temporary bridgehead from which further gains could be won. What should haunt us is not the no longer of actually existing social democracy, but the not yet of the futures that popular modernism trained us to expect, but which never materialized. These spectres, the spectres of lost futures, reproach the formal nostalgia of the capitalist realist world. Music culture was central to the projection of the futures which have been lost. The term music culture is crucial here because it is the culture constellated around music, fashion, discourse, cover art, that has been as important as the music itself in conjuring seductively unfamiliar worlds. The de-stranging of music culture in the 21st century, the ghastly return of industry moguls and boys next door to mainstream pop, the premium put on reality in popular entertainment, the increased tendency of those in music culture to dress and look like digitally and surgically enhanced versions of regular folk, the emphasis played on gymnastic emoting and singing, has played a major role in conditioning us to accept consumer capitalism's model of ordinariness. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri are right when they say that the revolutionary take on race, gender and sexuality struggles goes far beyond the demand that different identities be recognized. Ultimately, it is about the dismantling of identity. The revolutionary process of the abolition of identity, we should keep in mind, is monstrous, violent and traumatic. Don't try to save yourself. In fact, yourself has to be sacrificed. This does not mean that liberation casts us into an indifferent sea with no objects of identification, but rather the existing identities will no longer serve as anchors. While Hart and Negri are correct to warn of the traumatic dimensions of this transformation, as they are also aware it has its joyful aspects. Throughout the 20th century, music culture was a probe that played a major role in preparing the population to enjoy a future that was no longer white, male or heterosexual. a future in which the relinquishing of identities that were in any case poor fictions would be a blessed relief. In the 21st century, by contrast, and the fusion of pop with reality TV is absolutely indicative of this, popular culture has been reduced to being a mirror held up to late capitalist subjectivity. By now it should already be very clear that there are different senses of the word hauntology at play in Ghosts of My Life. There is the specific case in which it has been applied to music culture, and a more general sense where it refers to persistences, repetitions, prefigurations. There are also more or less benign versions of hauntology. Ghosts of My Life will move amongst these different uses of the term. This book is about the ghosts of my life, so there is necessarily a personal dimension to what follows. Yet my take on the old phrase, the personal is political, has been to look for the cultural, structural, political conditions of subjectivity. The most productive way of reading the personal is political is to interpret it as saying the personal is impersonal. It's miserable for anyone at all to be themselves, still more to be forced to sell themselves. Culture and the analysis of culture is valuable insofar as it allows an escape from ourselves. Such insights have been hard won. Depression is the most malign spectre that has dogged my life, and I use the term depression to distinguish the dreary solipsism of the condition from the more lyrical and collective desolations of hauntological melancholia. I started blogging in 2003, while still in such a state of depression that I found everyday life scarcely bearable. Some of these writings were part of the working through of the condition, and it's no accident that my so far successful escape from depression coincided with a certain externalization of negativity. The problem wasn't just me, but the culture around me. It's clear to me now the period from roughly 2003 to the present will be recognized not in the far distant future, but the very soon, as the worst period for popular culture since the 1950s. To say that the culture was desolate is not to say that there weren't traces of other possibilities. Ghosts of My Life is an attempt to engage with some of these traces. Ghosts of My Life, Goldie, Japan, Tricky. It must have been 1994 when I first saw Roughage Crew's Ghosts of My Life on the shelf of a high street record store. The 4-track EP had been released in 1993, but this was a time before internet hype and online discographies, when the traces of the underground took longer to surface. The EP was a prime example of dark side jungle. Jungle was a moment in what Simon Reynolds would come to call the hardcore continuum, the series of mutations on the British dance music underground triggered by the introduction of the breakbeat into rave, passing from hardcore rave into jungle, speed garage, two-step. I'll always prefer the name jungle to the more pallid and misleading term drum and bass, because much of the allure of the genre came from the fact that no drums or bass guitar were played. Instead of simulating the already existing qualities of real instruments, digital technology was exploited to produce sounds that had no pre-existing correlates. The function of time stretching, which allowed the time signature of a sound to be changed without its pitch being altered, transformed sampled backbeats into rhythms that no human could play. Producers would also use the strange metallic excrescence that was produced when samples were slowed down and the software had to fill in the gaps. The result was an abstract rush that made chemicals all but redundant, accelerating our metabolisms, heightening our expectations, reconstructing our nervous systems. It is also worth holding on to the name jungle because it evokes a terrain, the urban jungle, or rather the underside of a metropolis that was just in the process of being digitalized. It has sometimes seemed as if the use of the word urban is a polite synonym for black music. Yet it's possible to hear urban not as some disavowal of race, but as an invocation of the powers of cosmopolitan conviviality. At the same time, however, jungle was by no means an unequivocal celebration of the urban. If jungle celebrated anything, it was the lure of the dark. Jungle liberated the suppressed libido in the dystopian impulse, releasing and amplifying the jouissance that comes from anticipating the annihilation of all current certainties. As Codwo Eshun argued, in jungle there was a libidinization of anxiety itself, a transformation of fight and flight impulses into enjoyment. This was deeply ambivalent. At one level, what we were hearing here was a kind of sonic fictional intensification and extrapolation of the neoliberal world's destruction of solidarity and security. Nostalgia for the familiarity of small-town life was rejected in Jungle, but its digital city was devoid of the comfort of strangers. No one could be trusted here. Jungle took many of its cues from the Hobbesian scenarios of 80s films such as Blade Runner, Terminator, and Predator 2. It's no accident that all three of these films are about hunting. Jungle's world was one in which entities, human as well as non-human, stalked each other for sport as well as for sustenance. Yet Darkside Jungle was about the thrill of the chase, about the video game euphoria anxiety of eluding ruthless predators as much as it was about the exhilaration of running prey to ground. At another level, Darkside Jungle projected the very future that capital can only disavow. Capital can never openly admit that it is a system based on inhuman rapacity. The Terminator can never remove its human mask. Jungle not only ripped the mask off, it actively identified with the inorganic circuitry beneath, hence the android Death's Head that Refuge crew used as their logo. The paradoxical identification with death and the equation of death with the inhuman future was more than a cheap nihilist gesture. At a certain point, the unrelieved negativity of the dystopian drive trips over into a perversely utopian gesture, and annihilation becomes the condition of the radically new. I was a postgraduate student in 1994, and I didn't have either the nerve or the money to hang around specialist record shops to pick up all the latest releases. So I would access Jungle tracks in much the same fitful way that I had followed American comics in the 70s. I would pick them up where and when I could, usually on CD compilations issued long after their dubplate freshness had cooled. For the most part, it was impossible to impose any narrative on Jungle's relentless flow. Fittingly, for a sound that was so depersonalized and dehumanized, the names of the acts tended to be cryptic cyberpunk tags, disconnected from any biography or place. Jungle was best enjoyed as an anonymous electro-libidinal current that seemed to pass through producers as a series of effects and FX that were delinked from authors. It sounded like some audio unlife form, a ferocious feral artificial intelligence that had been unwittingly called up in the studio, the breakbeats like genetically augmented hounds straining to be free of the leash. Refuge Crew were one of the few Jungle acts about which I knew a little. Because of Simon Reynolds' evangelical pieces on Jungle in the now long defunct Melody Maker, I was aware that Refuge Crew was one of the aliases used by Goldie, who, almost uniquely in the anonymity of the jungle scene, was already becoming a recognizable face. If there was to be a face for this faceless music, then Goldie, a mixed-race former graffiti artist with gold teeth, was a strong candidate. Goldie was formed by hip-hop culture, but irrevocably altered by rave's collective delirium. His career became a parable for a whole series of impasses. The temptation for any producer emerging from the ceneus of the hardcore continuum was always to renounce the essentially collective nature of the conditions of production. It was a temptation that Goldie was unable to resist, but tellingly, his records declined the very moment he stopped using impersonal, collective names for his project and started releasing them under the, albeit assumed, name Goldie. His first album, Timeless, smoothed out the anorganic angles of jungle with the use of analog instruments and an alarming jazz-funk tastefulness. Goldie became a minor celebrity, took part in the BBC soap opera EastEnders, and only in 2008 released the kind of album that Refuge Crew should have put out 15 years before. The lesson was clear. Urban British artists can only be successful if they depart from the ceneus, if they leave behind the collective. The first records Goldie and his collaborators released under the names Refuge Crew and Metalheads were still high on rave's carny buzz. 1992's Terminator was the most epochal. Jittery with excitable rave stabs, its phased and time-stretched beats suggested aberrant impossible geometries, while its vocal samples, from Linda Hamilton in Terminator, talked of time paradoxes and fatal strategies. The record sounded like a commentary on itself, as if the temporal anomalies that Hamilton described, "You're talking about things that I haven't done yet in the past tense," were made physical in the vertiginously imploding sound. As Refuge Crew progressed, their sound became sleeker. Where the early records put one in mind of an assemblage of dismembered organs that had been crudely stitched together, the later releases more closely resembled mutants that had been genetically engineered. The unruly and volatile rave elements had gradually drained away, to be replaced by textures that were starker, moodier. The titles, Dark Rider, Fury, Manslaughter, told their own story. As you listened, you felt like you were being pursued through a near-future brutalist arcade. Vocal samples were cut back and became more subdued and ominous. Manslaughter features one of the most electrifying lines from Blade Runner's rogue replicant Roy Batty. If only you could see what I've seen, through your eyes. The perfect slogan for Jungle's new mutants, engineered by street science to have heightened senses but a shorter lifespan. I bought any Refuge Crew record that I came upon, but Ghosts of My Life brought a special tingle of intrigue because of its title, with its suggestion of Japan's 1981 art pop masterpiece, Ghosts. When I played the Ghosts of My Life 12, I quickly realized with a shiver of exhilaration that the pitched-down voice repeating the title phrase did indeed belong to Japan's David Sylvian. But this wasn't the only trace of Ghosts. After some atonal washes and twitchy breakbeats, the track lurched to a sudden halt, and, in a moment that still takes my breath away when I listen to it now, a brief snatch of the spidery, abstract electronics instantly recognizable from the Japan record leapt into the chasm, before being immediately consumed by vicious bass ooze and the synthetic screeches that were the sonic signatures of Darkside Jungle. Time had folded in on itself. One of my earliest pop fixations had returned, vindicated in an unexpected context. Early 80s new romantic synth pop, reviled and ridiculed in Britain, but revered in the dance music scenes of Detroit, New York and Chicago, was finally coming home to roost in the UK underground. Codwo Eshun, then at work on his More Brilliant Than the Sun, Adventures in Sonic Fiction, would argue that synth-pop played the same founding role for techno, hip-hop and jungle as Delta Blues did for rock, and it was as if a disavowed part of myself, a ghost from another part of my life, was being recovered, although in a permanently altered form. Just when I think I'm winning. In 1982, I taped Ghosts from the radio and chain listened to it, pressing play, rewinding the cassette, repeating. Ghosts is a record which, even now, compels you to keep replaying it. Partly that's because of the way the record teems with detail. You never feel you've fully grasped it all. Nothing else that Japan recorded was like Ghosts. It is an anomaly not only because of its seeming confessionalism, exceptional in the work of a group which favoured aesthetic poses over emotional expression, but also because of its arrangement, its texture. Elsewhere on Tin Drum, the 1981 album from which Ghosts came, Japan had developed a plastic ethno-funk, where electronics flitted through the elasticated rhythmic architecture created by the bass and drums. On Ghosts, however, there are no drums and no bass line. There is only percussion that sounds like metallic vertebrae being gently struck, and a suite of sounds so austerely synthetic that they could have come from Stockhausen. Ghosts begins with chimes that make you feel like you are inside some metallic clock. The air is charged, an electrical field through which unintelligible radio wave chitterings pass. At the same time, the track is pervaded by an immense stillness, a poise. Watch the group's extraordinary live performance of Ghosts on the Old Grey Whistle test. They look as if they are tending their instruments rather than playing them. Only Sylvian appears animated, and then it's only his face, half hidden by the heavy fringe, that moves. The mannered angst of his vocals sits oddly with the electronic austerity of the music. Its sense of enervated foreboding is broken by the only trace of melodrama in the song, the synth stabs which, simulating the kind of strings you'd hear on a movie thriller score, cue in the chorus. Just when you think I'm winning, when I've broken every door, the ghosts of my life blow wilder than the wind. What exactly are the ghosts that haunt Sylvian? The song derives much of its potency from declining to answer, from its lack of specificity. We can fill in the blanks with our own spectres. What's clear is that it isn't external contingencies which ruin his well-being. Something from his past, something he wants to have left behind, keeps returning. He can't leave it behind because he carries it with him. Is he anticipating the destruction of his happiness, or has the destruction already happened? The present tense, or rather the hesitation between past and present tense, creates an ambiguity, suggesting a fatalistic eternity, a compulsion to repeat, a compulsion that might be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The ghosts return because he fears they will. It's hard not to hear Ghosts as a reflection of sorts on Japan's career up to that point. The group was the culmination of a certain English take on art pop that began with Bowie and Roxy music in the early 70s. They came from Beckenham, Catford, Lewisham, the unglamorous conurbation where Kent joins South London, the same suburban hinterland from which David Bowie, Billy Idol and Susie Sue had come. As with most English art pop, Japan found their environment only a negative inspiration, something to escape from. There was a conscious drive away from everything that childhood represented, Sylvian has remarked. Pop was the portal out of the prosaic. Music was only part of it. Art pop was a finishing school for working-class autodidacts, where, by following up the clues left behind by early pioneers, the allusions secreted in lyrics, in track titles or in interview references, you could learn about things that weren't on the formal curriculum for working-class youth. Fine art, European cinema, avant-garde literature. Changing your name was the first step, and Sylvian had traded his given name, Bat, for one that referred to Sylvain Sylvain from the New York Dolls, the group whose style Japan had begun by imitating. By the time of Ghosts, all of the errats American swagger of the Dolls phase is long forgotten, and Sylvian has long since perfected his plastic mass-produced copy of Brian Ferry. In his analysis of Brian Ferry's voice, Ian Penman argues that its peculiar quality came from an only partly successful attempt to get his Geordie accent to forge a classic, timeless Englishness. Sylvian's singing voice is the faking of a fake. The almost whinnying quality of Ferry's angst is retained, but transposed into a pure styling devoid of emotional content. It is cultured, not natural at all, prissy, ultra-affected, and for that very reason, strangely lacking in effect. It couldn't contrast more with Sylvian's speaking voice at the time. Awkward, tentative, strongly bearing all the traces of class in South London, which his singing voice had sought to remove. Sons of pioneers are hungry men. Ghosts was paralysed by very English anxieties. You could imagine Pip from Great Expectations singing it. In England, working class escape is always haunted by the possibility that you will be found out, that your roots are showing. You won't know some crucial rule of etiquette that you should. You will pronounce something wrongly. Mispronunciation is a constant source of anxiety for the autodidact, because books don't necessarily tell you how to say words. Is Ghosts the moment when art pop confronts this fear? That class will out, that one's background can never be transcended, that the rude spectres of Lewisham will return no matter how far east you travel? Japan had pursued art pop into a sheer superficiality, which exceeded even their inspirations in its depthless aestheticism. Tin Drum, the 1981 album from which Ghosts came, was art pop as Barth is pop, a conspicuous playing with signs for their own seductive sake. The album cover immediately drew you into their heavily confected world. Sylvian, his heavily sprayed peroxided fringe falling artfully over his Trevor Horn specs, sits in a simulation of a simple Chinese dwelling, chopsticks in hand, as a Mao poster peels from the wall behind him. Everything is posed, every sign selected with a fetishistic fastidiousness. Check the way his eyeshadow gives his eyelids an almost opiated heaviness, but at the same time everything is so painfully fragile. His face a no mask, anemically ultra-white, his body posture ragdoll drained. Here he is, one of the last glam princes, and perhaps the most magnificent, his face and body rare and delicate works of art, not extrinsic to, or lesser than the music, but forming an integral component of the overall concept. All social, political, cultural meaning seems to be drained from these references. When Sylvian sings Red Army Needs You on the closing track Cantonese Boy, it is the same spirit of semiotic Orientalism. The Chinese and Japanese empires of signs are reduced to images, exploited and coveted for their frisson. By the time of Tin Drum, Japan have perfected their transition from New York dolls trash hounds to gentlemen connoisseurs, from working-class Beckenham youth into cosmopolitan men about town. Or they've achieved as much as is possible. Ghosts suggest that the transition will never be so successful as to eliminate anxiety. The more you've disguised your background, the more it will hurt when it is exposed. Tin Drum's superficiality is the superficiality of the glossy photograph, the group's detachment that of the photographer. Images are decontextualized, then reassembled to form an oriental panorama that is strangely abstract. A Far East as surrealist novelist Raymond Roussel might have reimagined it. Like Ferry, Sylvian remains subject as well as object, not only the frozen image, but also he who assembles images, not in any pathological peeping Tom sense, but in a coolly detached way. The detachment, naturally, is a performance, concealing anxiety as it sublimates it. The words are little labyrinths, enigmas with no possible solution. The appearance of enigmas, perhaps, false-fronted follies decorated with Chinese and Japanese motifs. Sylvian's voice belongs to this masquerade. Even on Ghosts, Sylvian's voice does not ask to be taken at face value. It is not a voice that reveals, or even pretends to reveal. It is a voice to hide behind, just like the makeup, the conspicuously worn signs. It is not only the fixation on geography that makes Sylvian seem like a tourist, an outside observer even in his own inner life. His voice seems to come entirely from his head, barely from his body at all. And after this, Japan would fall apart, while Duran Duran were already more than halfway towards taking a lumpen version of Japan's shtick into superstardom. For Sylvian, there was a pursuit of authenticity which was connoted by two things: the turn away from rhythm and the embracing of real instruments, the wiping away of the cosmetics, the quest for meaning, the discovery of a real self. Yet, until 2003's Blemish, Sylvian's solo records seemed as if they were straining towards an emotional authenticity that his voice simply could not deliver. Only now they lacked the alibi of aestheticism. Tin Drum was Japan's final studio album, but it was also one of the last moments in English art pop. One future had quietly died, but others would surface. Your Eyes Resemble Mine. A fragment of Japan's Ghosts washed up 14 years later on Tricky's first single, Aftermath. Here it wasn't sampled, but cited by Tricky's mentor, fellow Bristolian Mark Stewart. In the background of the trap's loping shanty rhythms, you can hear Stewart sing the lines, "Just when I thought I was winning, just when I thought I could not be stopped." The use of the Japan reference and the presence of Stewart, a major figure in Bristol post-punk since his time with the pop group in the 70s, were already powerful clues that Tricky's positioning as a trip-hop artist was reductive and misleading. Too often, the label trip-hop would be applied to what was in effect a black music with the blackness muted or excised, hip-hop without rap. The trip in Tricky's music had less to do with psychedelics and more to do with the foggy indolence of marijuana. But Tricky pursued ganja inertia well beyond stoner lassitude into a visionary condition in which rap's aggression and braggadocio weren't so much removed as refracted in the heat haze of a dreamy hydroponic humidity. On the face of it, Tricky's rap could be heard as the British answer to hip-hop, but on a more subterranean level, what he was also taking up and renewing were strands in post-punk and art pop. Tricky counts post-punk acts like Blondie, the Banshees, and The Cure, the last great pop band, I think, he says, as his precursors. It's not as simple as opposing this lineage to the soul, funk, and dub references which were so obvious in Tricky's earliest music. Post-punk and art pop had already drawn substantially upon folk and dub. "I grew up in a white ghetto," Tricky said when I interviewed him in 2008. "My dad's Jamaican, my grandmother is white. When I was growing up, till I was about 16, everything was normal. When I moved to an ethnic ghetto, I had friends there and my friends would say, 'Why do you hang out with those skinhead guys, the white guys?' And my skinhead friends were like, 'Why are you hanging out with those black guys?' I couldn't get it. I couldn't understand it. I could always go to both worlds. I could go to a reggae club and then to a white club and not even notice it because my family is all different colours, different shades. So at Christmas, you got a white person, black person, African-looking person, Asian-looking person. We didn't notice it. My family are colorblind. But all of a sudden things started moving around, learning bad habits, people whispering to you like, "Why are you hanging out with those white guys?" These are kids I grew up with since 5 years old. The guys I grew up with saying, "Why are you hanging out with those black guys?" Then I see the specials on TV, these white and black guys getting together. Tricky appeared at the very moment when the reactionary pantomime of Britpop, a rock which had whitewashed out contemporary black influencers, was moving towards dominance. The phony face-off between Blur and Oasis, which preoccupied the media, was a distraction from the real fault lines of British music culture at the time. The conflict that really mattered was between a music which acknowledged and accelerated what was new in the 90s, technology, cultural pluralism, genre innovations, and a music which took refuge in a monocultural version of Britishness, a swaggering white boy rock built almost entirely out of forms that were established in the 60s and 70s. This was a music designed to reassure anxious white males at a moment when all of the certainties they had previously counted on, in work, sexual relations, ethnic identity, were coming under pressure. As we now know, Britpop would win the struggle. Tricky would slink away to become the herald of a future for British music that never materialised. A rapprochement of sorts between Tricky and Britpop was thankfully missed. Blur's Damon Albarn was supposed to guest on the album Tricky recorded under the name Nearly God, alongside the Specials' Terry Hall among many others, but the track that the pair recorded together was removed from the album before it was released. When Maxon Key was released in 1995, Tricky was immediately anointed as the voice of a mute, depoliticized generation, the wounded prophet who absorbed and transmitted a decade's psychic pollution. The extent of this adulation can be gauged by the origin of the name Nearly God. A German journalist had asked him, "What's it like to be God?" "Well, nearly God." Instead of taking up his assigned role as the imp of the perverse in 90s mainstream pop, though, Tricky sidled off into the sidelines, a half-forgotten figure. So much so that, when he appeared as a guest at Beyoncé's 2011 Glastonbury performance, it provoked a gasp of shock. As if for a moment we'd stumbled into some alternative reality where Tricky was where he deserved to be, a glamorous gargoyle on the edifice of 21st century pop. All too symbolically, however, Tricky's microphone didn't seem to be switched on, and he could barely be heard. On Maxon Key, Ian Penman wrote in his landmark March 1995 essay for The Wire magazine, Tricky sounds like ghosts from another solar system. The spectrality of Tricky's music, the way it refused to step up or represent, the way it slurred between lucidity and inarticulacy, made for a sharp contrast with the multicoloured brashness of what Penman called the face cover, talkin' loud, jazzy B nexus of groovy one-world vibery. What's so significant about the version of multiculturalism that Tricky and Goldie proffered was its refusal of earnestness and worthiness. Theirs was not a music that petitioned for inclusion in any kind of ordinariness. Instead, it revelled in the otherworldliness, its science fiction glamour. Like art pop's first pioneer, Bowie, it was about identification with the alien, where the alien stood in for the technologically new and the cognitively strange, and ultimately for forms of social relations that were as yet only faintly imaginable. Bowie was by no means the first to make this identification. Loving the Alien was a gesture that self-mythologizing Black Magi, Codwo Eshen's sonic fictional canon of Lee Perry, George Clinton and Sun Ra, had made long before Bowie first did it. Identifying with the alien, not so much speaking for the alien as letting the alien speak through you, was what gave 20th century popular music much of its political charge. Identification with the alien meant the possibility of an escape from identity into other subjectivities, other worlds. There was also identification with the android. Aftermath includes a sample of dialogue from Blade Runner. "I'll tell you about my mother." The anti-Oedipal taunt that the replicant Leon throws at his interrogator-tormentor before killing him. Is it merely coincidence that the Sylvian quote and the Blade Runner lift converge in the same song, Penman asks. Ghosts. Replicants? Electricity has made us all angels. Technology, from psychoanalysis to surveillance, has made us all ghosts. The replicant, "Your eyes resemble mine," is a speaking void. The scary thing about Aftermath is that it suggests that nowadays we all are speaking voids, made up only of scraps and citations, contaminated by other people's memories, adrift. When I met Tricky in 2008, he referred unbidden to the line from Aftermath that Penman picks up on here. My first lyric ever on a song was, "Your eyes resemble mine, you'll see as no others can." I never had any kids then, so what am I talking about? Who am I talking about? My daughter Maisie wasn't born. My mother used to write poetry, but in her time she couldn't have done anything with that. There wasn't any opportunity. It's almost like she killed herself to give me the opportunity. My lyrics, I can never understand why I write as a female. I think I've got my mum's talent. I'm her vehicle. So I need a woman to sing that. Hauntology then, telepathy, the persistence of the no longer. You don't have to believe in the supernatural to recognize that the family is a haunted structure, an overlook hotel full of presentiments and uncanny repetitions, something that speaks ahead of us instead of us. From the start, like all of us, Tricky was haunted, and the crepitational texture of the 21st century hauntology was already being auditioned on Tricky's earliest recordings. When I first heard Burial a decade later, I would immediately reach for Tricky's first album, Maxinque, as a point of comparison. It wasn't only the use of vinyl crackle, so much as a signature of both Maxinque and Burial that suggested the affinity. It was also the prevailing mood, the way suffocating sadness and mumbling melancholy bled into lovelorn eroticism and dream speech. Both records feel like emotional states transformed into landscapes, but where Burial's music conjures urban scenes under Blade Runner permadrizzle, Maxinque feels as if it's taking place in a desert, as delirial and Dali-esque as the initiatory space that characters pass through in Nick Rogue's Walkabout. The land is scorched, cracked and barren, but there are occasional bursts of verdant lushness. On the queasily erotic Abaddon Fat tracks, for instance, we could have strayed into the ruined pastoral of Talk Talk's Spirit of Eden. Your eyes resemble mine. From the very beginning, speaking in his dead mother's voice, a semi-benign Norman Bates, Tricky was conscious of his dispossession by female spectres. With his predilection for cosmetics and cross-dressing, he looked like one of the last vestiges of glam impulse in British pop. His gender ambivalence a welcome antidote to Britpop's lumpen laddishness. It's clear that gender indeterminacy is no pantomime mummery for him, but something that goes right to the core of his music. Saying that Tricky writes from a female point of view fails to capture the uncanniness of what he does, since he also induces women to sing from what seems to be a male perspective. I like putting women in a male role, to have the woman play the strength and the man be the weak. I was brought up, one of my uncles was in jail for 30 years and the other for 15 years. I didn't see my dad. I was brought up by my grandmother and my auntie, so I've seen my grandmother fight in the street. I've seen my auntie and my grandmother have fist fights. I've seen my grandmother grab my auntie's arm and close it in on the door and break her arm fighting over meat. So I see women as tough. They fed me, they clothed me. My grandmother taught me to steal. My auntie taught me to fight. She sent me to boxing when I was 15. If men go to war, you stand in one field, I stand in another. We shoot each other, but what's the hardest is when you're at home and you gotta listen to kids cry and you gotta feed 'em. That's tough. I've seen no men around. I've seen my uncle go to jail for 7 years, then 10 years. My other uncle, my dad never rang. Women keep it together, keep food on the table, defend us, defend the children. Like if anyone fucked with us, they'd be down the school. I've never seen men do that for me. I've never seen men there for me like that. All I know is women. Gender doesn't dissolve here into some bland unisex mush. Instead, it resolves into an unstable space in which subjectivity is continually sliding from male to female voice. It is an art of splitting, which is also an art of doubling. Through the women who sing for or as him, Tricky becomes less than one, a split subject that can never be restored to wholeness. Yet their voicing of his incompleteness also makes him more than one, a double in search of a lost other half it will never recover. Either way, what Tricky unsettles, both as a vocalist and as a writer and producer who coaxes singing from an other, is the idea of the voice as a rock-solid guarantor of presence and identity. His own weakened, recessed voice, all those croaks, mumbles and murmurs, has always suggested a presence that was barely there, something supplementary rather than centred. but the main, usually female voice on his songs also sounds absented and abstracted. What the voices of his female singers, flat, drained, destitute of ordinary effective cadences, most resemble is the sound of a medium, a voice being spoken by something else. So this is the aftermath. It is not that Tricky possesses female singers, more that he induces them into sharing his trance states. The words that come to him from a lost female source are returned to a female mouth. I'm already on the other side, as Martina Topley Bird sang on I Be the Prophet from the Nearly God LP. Tricky's upbringing was particularly gothic. My grandmother used to keep me at home because my step-grandfather used to be out working, and she used to watch all these black and white horror movies, vampire movies, and it was like growing up in a movie. She used to sit me in the middle of the floor, 'cause she lost my mum, her daughter. She'd be playing Billie Holiday, smoking a cigarette, and would say things like, "You look like your mum," watching me. I was always my mum's ghost. I grew up in a dreamlike state. One time I've seen a suicide off an NCP car park, and the police took me down to see what I saw, and the next day in the Evening Post there was my name in there. I woke up and it was on the fridge. My grandmother had put it on the fridge like I was famous. The one who is possessed is also dispossessed, of their own identity and voice. But this kind of dispossession is of course a precondition for the most potent writing and performance. Writers have to tune into other voices. Performers must be capable of being taken over by outside forces, and Tricky can be a great live performer because of his capacity to work himself up into a state of head-shaking shamanic self-erasure. Like the occult, religion provides a symbolic repertoire which deals with the idea of an alien presence using the tongue, of the dead having influence on the living, and Tricky's language has always been saturated with biblical imagery. Like the occult, religion provides a symbolic repertoire which deals with the idea of an alien presence using the tongue, of the dead having influence on the living, and Tricky's language has always been saturated with biblical imagery. Maxinquay's purgatorial landscape was littered with religious signs, while pre-millennium tension exhibited what seemed like religious mania. I saw a Christian in Kristiansand, a devil in Helsinki. Here come the Nazarene, look good in a magazine. Mary Magdalene, that'll be my first sin. When I interviewed Tricky, he had just released the single Council Estate. Here, class spectres spoke, but not for the first time in Tricky's work. Class rage could be detected smouldering in many of his tracks from the beginning. Master your language, and until then, I'll create my own, he warned on 1996 Kristiansand, casting himself as the proletarian Caliban, plotting revenge on his alleged betters. He is acutely aware of the way in which class determines destiny. Breaking into a house or car equals locksmiths, insurance, it's all making money off me. The longer I'm in prison, you're making more money. Modern day slavery, instead of slaves, they turned them into criminals. Tricky called the album from which Council Estate came Knoll West, after the area of Bristol in which he grew up. When I was at school, there was one certain teacher who said, when you go for a job, as soon as you put your postcode down and they know you're from Knoll West, you ain't going to get the job. So lie. If you're going to fill in your application forms, lie. Council Estate conceived of resentment as a motivating force and success as revenge. It wasn't about leaving your past behind, as Sylvian wanted to. It is about succeeding so that your class origins can be forced back down the throat of those who said you couldn't succeed. Like so many working-class pop stars before him, including Sylvian, success provided vindication for Tricky and gave him access to a world which both attracted and appalled him. 1996's Tricky Kid was his take on the theme of class dislocation that has preoccupied British pop stars since at least as far back as the Kinks. It was the best song about a working-class male projected out of their milieu into the pleasure gardens of the hyper-successful since the Associates Club Country. A drive from nowhere leaves you in the cold. Every breath you breathe belongs to someone there. With its febrile Jacob's Ladder-like version of leering hedonism, coke in your nose, everyone wants to be naked and famous, Tricky Kid anticipated the way in which, in the first decade of the 21st century, working-class ambitions would be bought off by the fool's gold of celebrity culture and reality TV. Now they call me superstar, it demonically proclaimed. A line echoed in the refrain of Council Estate. Why is superstar such an important word for him? Because it's such a stupid word in a way. What used to happen is that you make an album, and if your album's successful, fame is almost part of the game. When I was starting off, I just wanted to make a good album. I wanted to make something that no one's ever heard before. I wasn't interested in anything else.